Hey everyone, welcome to Live Your Language, tips and inspiration for your bilingual family. I am Stephanie, a PhD student in second language acquisition and a mother to a child that I am raising bilingually in my non-native language, French. Today I'll be talking about something that's really exciting to me, and I'm sure that you guys are interested in this too, and that is how to choose another language to introduce to your child. So before I get into this, I just wanted to speak briefly about my motivation for this and why I'm so excited about sharing another language with my child. I have always loved languages from a very early age. I have loved learning them, I love studying them, I just love hearing them and encountering other people who also speak them. It's just a real passion of mine, and I'm sure that a lot of you feel the same way. So when I was thinking about raising my child, I knew that I definitely wanted him to be bilingual. Now that we're about 2 years in and things seem to be going pretty well, I feel a little bit emboldened by our success so far, and I've really been thinking about how to introduce a third language. So keep listening, because at the end I'll talk all about the various steps that I went through to decide how to choose another language and which one we ended up deciding on. So I always knew that I wanted to introduce my child to a third language, but I kind of hesitated on when to do this. Now, that's not the focus of this video, but I really love what Kendall and Alison Mackey say in their book, The Bilingual Edge, which is it's never too early to introduce a language and it's never too late. The right time is now. So that piece of advice really helped me move ahead and start thinking seriously about how to introduce this language and what it might be. When deciding which language to introduce to your child, there are a couple really important things to consider. The first is to think about which languages you already speak. That also incorporates things like your proficiency, how comfortable you'll be speaking with your child in that language, and whether or not you are willing to introduce somebody else into that role. I know that there are some parents who know a lot of languages but still choose to focus on only one language with their child. So it's a very personal choice, but it's something that you have to think about. The next thing that you want to consider is what community resources are available to you in this language. There might be meetup groups with moms who speak this language. There might be classes or just a lot of speakers of this language around available for babysitting. You might even have a language where you could hear it regularly at the supermarket or just around in your community. The next thing I want you to consider is family languages. Now, I don't just mean the heritage languages, which are languages that are linked to your family through heritage. Maybe your mother grew up in a certain country and they speak this, or your spouse's family have origins in a certain country and his grandmother speaks this language but he doesn't, that sort of thing. I'm also talking about the languages that the members of your family already know for one reason or another. Is your spouse familiar with a certain language because he or she took a couple years of that language in college or in high school? So basically, I just want to focus on those elements that are non-linguistic but that are also going to help motivate your child to continue learning the language and you to keep pursuing it and helping and supporting that child in learning the language. The next thing I think it's really important to consider is budget. So if you're like me and you had an unlimited budget and unlimited time, there's really no limit to the languages that you would introduce to your child. But unfortunately, we all have those constraints, and we have to be realistic about what sorts of things we can actually do to support this language learning. Also, something to be considered in budget is when you consider your own languages, your family languages, and that sort of thing, if you determine that actually you're gonna need extra outside support for this language, that's something that you're also going to have to consider in your budget. The next thing you really want to consider is opportunity. Is there any reason why now versus a couple years down the line might be ideal to start a language? Are you working in a country that you're only said to live in for a couple more years? Or do you have an au pair, or do you have a resource or a family member or something like that living with you now that is not going to be living with you a year or two from now? Those are the sorts of things that you're going to want to consider when thinking about which language to introduce to your child. And the last thing that is really important to consider is defining your goals. What does success look like to you? This is really important because I have to look up this figure, but I believe that I've read that in order for your child to be a productive speaker of a language, they need about 30% of their language input to be in that language. So for me, for example, and I think a lot of you, it's really important for me to have a productive speaker of a language. That to me is success, because it's really important for me, for my child and language in general. I think that's the purpose of it, is to connect with others. So productive ability is really important to me. Another thing to consider when you're thinking about goals is the ability to continue learning this language and the sustainability of learning this language for your child. So I know that a lot of you are probably thinking that you want whatever language that you introduce to your child to be something that they can continue going forward throughout their life, and hopefully eventually take an interest in, pick up themselves, and maybe find other opportunities to continue this language learning on their own. So that's something else that you want to consider. But a lot of others may not be too concerned about this. They may be more concerned about the cognitive benefits of language learning and not necessarily concerned about the longevity and the sustainability of learning this language in their child's life. So that's just something that's really important to consider. If you stuck with me this long, thanks a lot. And now I'm going to be talking about how I applied these principles to selecting my child's third language. So the first thing I mentioned, the languages that I speak. So my best language obviously is English, but aside from that, my best non-native language is French. So for me, that was a very easy decision to speak that with my child first. But now that French seems to be pretty established as his first language along with English, the next contender was really Arabic, which is my next most proficient language. I also know Spanish, but I'm at the intermediate level in Spanish, whereas I would consider myself more advanced in Arabic. However, the thing about my Arabic level is that I'm advanced in a more literary version, MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, not necessarily a dialect. I have never studied an Arabic dialect closely, so that is something to consider. And the third language we were considering was Chinese. Now, I have zero proficiency in Chinese, and that's the same for my husband too, but we really liked the idea of Chinese because it's a difficult language for native English speakers to learn. So we thought that maybe it would be a really great idea to introduce our son to Chinese early on, and that way he would have a little bit of an advantage going forward. Also, I feel like because Chinese is so difficult for native English speakers to learn, it's just really hard to connect with that culture with the huge language barrier. And I really think that learning Chinese could be a great way for our son to sort of break down those barriers that are more difficult for native English speakers and really make the most of an opportunity. Now, the next thing to consider was community resources. So by far, when thinking about these three languages, the language with the most community resources was definitely Spanish. In this area, we have not only a lot of story times in Spanish, playgroups in Spanish, but I also found multiple Spanish-speaking daycares and Spanish-speaking preschools, which is something that we're looking into in the coming years. Unfortunately, I didn't find anything about Arabic as far as resources go, and we actually have a Chinese school in our area that is kind of like a Saturday school, so there are opportunities for that here as well. So now I'm going to be talking about family as it relates to these languages. So unfortunately, we don't have any heritage links to these languages, but we do have a lot of connection to Spanish. So my twin sister learned Spanish all throughout high school. My husband took 2 or 3 years of Spanish, and also my father is completely fluent in Spanish, and my half-sister actually was raised as a Spanish and English bilingual. So we have a lot of links to Spanish. So right now, considering family links to languages, Spanish was definitely one that kind of rose to the top. Next was a consideration for budget. Now this was difficult because the thing that was really a little bit of a negative about Chinese was because neither me nor my husband have proficiency in Chinese, we would almost certainly have to outsource that by paying for an au pair or a nanny or some other person to come in and be the sole provider of Chinese instruction for him. With Spanish, it was a little bit more budget friendly because you could kind of wrap that cost into the cost of regular preschool and daycare. For Arabic, it wasn't, because there are just so few resources around, it didn't really come into consideration for budget. Maybe in that case, budget would more be a consideration of paying for classes and online tutoring. Next is considering the opportunity. One reason why Chinese really stood out to me as an option was that it actually is really difficult for native English speakers to acquire Chinese. It's actually one of the most difficult languages for native English speakers to acquire. And by starting early, we knew that our son would have an advantage to tackling this really difficult language. However, Spanish is a language that's a lot easier for native English speakers to learn, and it's often the language that a lot of people, at least here in the United States, it's their first second language that they learn in high school. So because it's not as difficult to acquire, it's very closely linked to French. It's a language that my son, if he chose to, could just start in middle school or high school and still reach a pretty decent level of proficiency. Arabic is also a language that's more commonly offered in high schools as well, but like Chinese, it's a little bit more difficult to acquire, especially because there are the considerations, like I told you, with modern standard Arabic and an Arabic dialect. And last, we considered our goals and what success would look like in these languages. It was really important that my son continue with the language that we choose. So for me, it wasn't sufficient to just start up a language and then kind of see where it went. So I knew that whatever language we chose, it would have to be something that we could sustain, because I didn't want it to just sort of fizzle out. So given that it was really important to continue the language and that my son has productive ability in these languages, it kind of narrowed down my choices a little bit. So the question with Chinese really became, it's really an important language to learn, but can we sustain this language? Is it something that we can make sure that we'll be able to keep up with and help support our son in, especially because neither of us have any proficiency in it. Considering Arabic, because productive ability was so important to me, and I knew that modern standard Arabic is not really the dialect of Arabic that everyday people speak, and that it would be a lot more difficult to find the people and the resources to support a dialect. That also kind of became a problem when thinking about goals. Okay, so given all of these things, you might have deduced that we actually decided to go with Spanish for the third language for my son to learn. Like I mentioned, because Spanish is a really easy language for native English speakers to learn, that was one of the things that kind of gave us pause, because he's so young and we know that this is really the time to learn those difficult languages. However, it was just so difficult to ignore the immense amount of community resources available, our family connection with my father being a fluent Spanish speaker and my sister being a fluent Spanish speaker, and my other sister, actually all of my sisters, speak Spanish really well. That was also an opportunity to draw them in and bring them into my son's life in a way that they have kind of been excluded to this point concerning French. Concerning my husband, I also like the idea of Spanish because while he does not consider himself a Spanish speaker, it's a language that he's a lot more familiar with, and hopefully this might encourage him to pick up the language to help support our child in that language as well. It was just something that made a lot of sense for us. Because I'm an intermediate speaker of Spanish, and because I think I've decided this so early in advance, I'm really gonna try and spin up my Spanish skills and learn alongside my son. And I think that it could just be a really fun opportunity for the family to pick up this third language in a way that French has not been. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening this far into my video. We are so excited to introduce our son to his third language. If you found this video useful, and if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and I will see you in the next video.